it's the classic dilemma. How do you help people in a country that is ruled by a group that is viewed as a terrorist organization, or any kind of country that is ruled by a particularly reprehensive government? And how do you make sure that the funds that you are sending do not wind up in the coffers of that government? They do not help its army, its officials. And so here there's this humanitarian impulse that comes up against the geopolitical reality that this is a situation where you have a government that is not recognized. And you will notice that Prime Minister Draghi of Italy, who organized this, kept emphasizing that putting foreign aid into Afghanistan does not mean recognizing the Afghan government. And this is where you have a division between Western countries and, let's say, Russia, that is willing to talk to the Taliban.
Well, you brought this up. How do you make sure humanitarian aid gets to the people? Because there's a legacy in Afghanistan. Even before the fall of Afghanistan, corruption beset the country with a prior government which was supported by the West.
There is a legacy of corruption, but now you have a legacy of the Taliban, and that is one of medieval brutality, of terrorizing the population. This is a regime that took power illegally, and it is not recognized by most countries around the world, and they will not be recognized. So the mechanism that they're trying to work with is to do it somewhat indirectly, to do it through United Nations organizations. But these United Nations groups do not have a particularly sterling record historically of being able to channel UN directed funds or from members of the United Nations without somehow the regimes also benefiting from it. So everything will have to be monitored very closely. And you may have to do it on a kind of sectoral basis. So for example, sending medicine that's fairly safe, because you want to send medicine, you want to avoid the spread of COVID. For example, the development of new mutations of that virus, so the population cannot get vaccines, polio vaccines for children, and that is important. But you also need to get food in. According to the UN, something like 18 million people in Afghanistan are at risk of possible starvation. So you have not only this humanitarian impulse, but you also have the reality that when Angela Merkel talks about the fact that she wants to make sure that we avoid chaos in Afghanistan, she's also thinking of the precedent of Syria. Refugees, millions of refugees coming across the border from Afghanistan into Iran, into Turkey, and ultimately into Europe.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, we're talking about the economy. It could collapse, but there is also still the threat of more violence. I was listening to a journalist from Afghanistan this week who said there is a likelihood of a civil war. It's a distinct possibility. Just how dire is the situation now, and how bad can it get?
The situation is horrific by any standard. The term horrific is sadly not an exaggeration as to what is happening in Afghanistan. We get word of bombings, and we have become kind of inured to some of what is happening in Afghanistan, because often it's not Western or foreign people who have been injured. But recently, there was a bombing at a mosque where something like 100 people plus were killed and badly injured. And this is happening in many parts of Afghanistan. And we don't even know the extent of this because there's very little transparency under the Taliban. We know that women are excluded from much of societal activity. We know that the charm offensive that the Taliban tried to engage in was very limited. It was very thin, and it's quickly disappearing. So you have a regime that is inherently illegitimate and intrinsically unstable. You have the problem that this is a wretchedly poor country. You have corruption that is historical. You have geopolitical concerns. You have humanitarian concerns. You have potential vast refugee problems. This is an enormous problem that almost defies solution. So the attempt here is somehow to maintain some kind of way of keeping the population from starving, keeping millions of people from having to flee across the borders and become international refugees.